dealing with the Kabeiroi is the basic identification of who they actually were and why they were worshipped. There are long-standing debates over which sanctuaries they belong to and even which sanctuaries worship them. There's presence of various similar cults in the ancient Mediterranean, and this just seems to complicate matters further. There are similar groups of deities, which both ancient and modern authors have conflated with one another. Now, although separate origins can sometimes be acknowledged for these different cult groups, this can only be done to a certain extent. The major groups often identified with the Kabeiroi are sometimes named as the megalotheoi, even the Dioscuri, and often the great gods of Samothrace, the Samothracian theoi. Now, if we accept the Kabeiroi and all these related cults as a single distinct group within the Greek pantheon, it's apparent that these deities are perhaps unnecessarily complicated. They vary in their nature, and there are differences in what they represent, their genealogical connections, the reason for their worship, and even such simple matters as how many there actually were. Now, the available evidence indicates that the Kabeiroi could be typically represented as a group of masculine deities whose function and background differed according to the needs of the community in which the cult is situated. And this variation may also account for some of the difficulties in attribution. Different gods with the same function have often been assimilated in the same way that gods with similar or identical names have been linked together as well, regardless of why they were worshipped. Now, just to put this in context, these are the known cult centres with possible connections to the Kabeiroi or one of the related groups, so you get an idea of how many there actually are. Now, on the basis of the available evidence, I've identified approximately 3 distinct main groups for the Kabeiroi. These 3 categories can be associated with 3 main cult centres: the sites at Thebes in central Greece, and the sites on Lemnos and Samothrace up in the northeastern Aegean. Now, they've all got quite distinct models. At Thebes, it's a father and son pairing. And this tends to fit with the Boeotian preference, the region in Greece in which they're from. They prefer to have male pairs as their gods, and the names vary depending on which text you read. The primary focus of the cult is quite Dionysiac in nature. It's very much associated with drinking, with wine, and also with agricultural practices, mainly with animals and livestock raising. At Lemnos, we have 3 brothers as the Kabeiroi, the sons of Hephaestus, and obviously the logical connection there with metalworking. At Samothrace, we're not entirely sure if they are really Kabeiroi. There is only one single inscription which refers to deities at the site as Kabeiroi, but if it is, there are 4 of them. They're non-Greek. They have 3 Greek names of Axieros, Axiokursos, Axiokursor, and Kadmelos, and these have been equated into the Greek pantheon with Demeter, Hades, Persephone, and Hermes. And this site seems to have a connection with the sea. Most of the cult offerings seem to relate to the protection of seafarers or for journeys successfully completed. Now, there's also the suggestion proposed for the sites at Samothrace and Thebes that the Kabeiroi are not actually the main gods. They're actually attendants of daemons who are there to serve more highly sort of fledged deities, usually associations with another goddess. Now, to this we can perhaps add a 4th cult type at Thessaloniki, and this is a single deity known as Kabeiros, and again we've got quite a strong connection with metalworking. The sites also appear in Asia Minor, and there are a number of them also connected into the Black Sea and in Egypt as well, with votives turning up in various places. Now, all the cult centres across the Eastern Mediterranean have appeared to have adopted one or more of these models as their cult type, which does suggest some common origin. Now, the founding dates indicated for the 3 centres at Thebes, Samothrace and Lemnos would suggest that Lemnos and Samothrace are actually the earliest 2, and these probably date to around the 7th century, maybe even the 8th century BC. The Theban evidence is a little bit more complicated because some of the earliest votives have been called into question. They've been dated to about the 10th century BC, but many people dispute that. So, are these gods parodied or not? And that's really what I want to sort of get across in this talk. The Theban site is known for its quite distinctive pottery, and this has sort of coloured everyone's view of the gods. Now, these are two vases, both from Thebes, both identified as a type of pottery known as Kabeiric Ware, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail later. But you can see the contrast. We've got little crazy pygmy and divine perfection. Now, I'll have a look at the literary evidence first, and I've included this on your handout. We have limited literature on the Kabeiroi. They're not gods that authors like to talk about. Indeed, when many of them refer to the Kabeiroi, they specifically say that they cannot talk about them for fear of divine retribution. But we do have a few sort of telling little fragments. First is from Aeschylus, possibly a satire play known as Kabeiroi. And we have the Kabeiroi addressing the Argonauts on their voyage to acquire the golden fleece. And they tell the Argonauts, "We shall make the house to be scant of vinegar." And academics have taken this in two ways. One, it means they're fabulous at winemaking, so none of it will spoil. Or two, they're going to drink the lot. Either way, it gives you a sense that there is a bit of humour in the cult, and that there's various rituals perhaps associated with the consumption of alcohol. The second evidence we've got comes from Herodotus's histories, and we have Cambyses, the king of Persia, entering a temple of Hephaestus and jeering at the image. And he also goes into the temple of the Kabeiroi, and he burnt the images here, and he mocks the statues. He again finds them grotesque and caricatured. Now, this site is probably actually an Egyptian god that's just been equated with the Kabeiroi. In contrast, we have Nonnasus Dionysiaca talking about the sons of Lemnian Kabeiro, the Kabeiroi sons, and here they very much follow more the Dioscuric tradition, where they're quite strong and handsome youths, and they're described in quite a grand fashion. Now, in contrast to this, we've got the modern take on it, and this is a recent text by Blakely, and she summarises the iconography of the Kabeiroi as this: "They are the sons of Hephaestus, a metallurgist only through that association. Their iconography ranges from dwarfish deformity in Herodotus' description and on the Theban vases to Dioscuric perfection." Now, I would actually argue that this is quite a flawed interpretation, and I shall go on to explain why. But firstly, is it so wrong to laugh at the gods? Now, there's an idea that religious occasions need to have a certain sense of dignity to them, and that ridicule and parody in these settings are somehow impious. Yet if we think about festivals and celebrations, which are a significant part of the ancient cults, and humour and good spirits would not really seem out of place in that context. And certainly the lubrication of such events through the consumption of alcohol perhaps, or other festivities, would also fit. And thinking back to the fragment of Aeschylus, there is certainly literary evidence to support this activity within the Kabeiric cult. And, to be honest, there's also an awful lot of archaeological evidence as well. Most of the debris from these sites consists of wine vessels and other paraphernalia associated with drinking. If we are to compare it to a similar cult model, if we take Eleusis as the example of a mystery cult in this context, it seems that humour can be incorporated into rituals. Now, at Eleusis, part of the initiation ceremonies and annual festivals may have involved reenactment of certain stories, as well as references to deliberate mockery of others by the participants, whether they were involved in the rituals or somehow outside them. There's references to people sailing up rivers, shouting at people on the riverbanks in Egypt, for example. Now, one of the main examples we get for Eleusis is from the Homeric hymn. There's other evidence as well, but I'm just going to touch on this one. And these lines refer to the moment when Demeter is made to smile and laugh again by the figure of Iambe. Now, prior to this point, the goddess had refused to laugh, smile, or neither eat nor drink. And the actions of Iambe not only made Demeter smile, they were also the catalyst for the goddess beginning to sort of live again, to eat, drink, and continue living. Now, this passage sort of emphasises the importance of laughter in life. And like sustenance, it's essential for physical and mental well-being. Now, the role of laughter in the Kabeiric cult can be seen through some of the elements of the iconography, but there was also epigraphic evidence which suggests that humour is part of the rituals. At Lemnos, we have quite an interesting text which refers to participants playing alongside the deity, and it's one of only a couple of usages of this particular term. Now, the main evidence that I'm going to look at is obviously the vases from Thebes. Now, as I said, it's quite an unusual site and an unusual cult. And the pottery, this type known as Kabeiric Ware, is almost unique within the world of Greek ceramics. And it has strong elements of caricature and grotesque, which are said to represent the ritual life of the sanctuary. Now, it seems to fall into three main phases. We have some very early material dating between 450 and 400 BC, and it's during this period when the grotesque and caricature style becomes established. Many of the elements are drawn from Daimonic iconography, and we seem to see a complete appropriation of these elements. By the time we get to the middle phase, between about 400 to 335 BC, they've sort of taken this iconography they've adopted and made it uniquely their own. And it's during this period which we see most of the parody scenes, which I'm going to show you. This is where they're mainly drawn from. By the time we get to the late tradition, we've actually got an avoidance of the figurative scenes. It's gone mainly to vegetable and floral motifs. So we do have a bit of a change. Now, within the Kabeiric Ware corpus, there's about 350 fragments and vases. There are a substantial number, which is approximately a quarter of the total, which show scenes of the gods or heroes drawn from mythology. Now, these include not only elements drawn from local traditions, such as the founding of Thebes, but we also have elements from the Trojan cycle and various other stories which are known throughout the ancient world. Now, the Kabeiric Ware depictions of these gods does show them in something of an unconventional light, shall we say. So, this is Odysseus and Circe. Perhaps not quite how you imagine them. There are multiple versions of this scene, and it seems to be drawn very much from theatrical performances. This scene is often accompanied by choruses of men with pig masks on dancing around. And you can see here we've got Odysseus as a little pot-bellied, stubby-legged. He doesn't really look the hero, and if we compare him then to Circe, she does look like she's got a curlers in this scene. That's the only way I can describe it. But it's always this particular scene. She's always mixing the kykion with which she hopes to enchant Odysseus, not knowing that he's already taken the herb which protects him. We have other scenes of Odysseus as well. There's one of him being blown around on a raft by Boreas, and the raft is made of amphora. And we also have a completely unrelated scene which shows him being chased by an ogre, which is obviously not drawn from the Homeric tradition. There are also scenes of the judgment of Paris, again. So the beauty contest, which was said to start the Trojan War, we have Athena and Hera as the first two. Telling which one is which is pretty nigh on impossible, but we can presume that this central figure who's being handed the victor's wreath is Aphrodite. There is another one of these scenes, and this time we do have some labelling. So we've got Hera labelled, and we have Pais labelled with A for Alexandros, and presumably this figure here is Aphrodite again, holding the victor wreath. We've got Hermes, and the two goddesses up here may actually be a scene of perhaps Athena and Artemis competing over who else is going to get to have a go in this beauty pageant. We also have heroes such as Hercules, Heracles, and you can see here the typical lion skin, and here he's battling with the river god. And as you can see, there's a very strong tradition in the iconography. The figures are all very uniformly caricatured. It's the same sort of little bandy leg, they've got pot bellies, the genitals are distorted, and there's major distortion to the facial characteristics as well. And just to show you one last one, this is the Battle of the Pygmies and Cranes, which is one of my favourites. And when you suddenly realise what they're doing. But you can see how this is quite caricatured, it's quite grotesque. It's taking the gods, the heroes and the mythological stories and twisting them into something they really you don't expect them to be. Now, in contrast, we have quite a strange situation at the Kabeiroi where other deities and other heroes can be parodied quite freely, yet the pairing of Kabeiros and Pais never are. They're always presented in, sort of, as I'm going to phrase it, divine perfection. And here we have one of the vases showed you before with the figure of Kabeiroi here. He's labelled so we know who he is, and you can see where the Dionysiac elements come in. We have the figure of Pais, his son, and yet the other figures in the scene, Mythos, Krateia, Kratalos and Satyra, are all shown in caricature. And this is not uncommon. We also have the figure here, this time with worshippers approaching him, but he's always shown in quite a dignified and sort of sensible light. Now, if we take evidence from elsewhere, we go to Thessaloniki and the numismatic evidence. Now, unlike the ceramic corpus from Thebes, the material from the other Kabeiric sites in terms of iconography is actually quite disparate. There's no assemblage comparable to Kabeiric ware, but there is evidence which we can consider. And what is clear is that the depiction of the deities is remarkably similar, despite differences in location or association. So it seems that there is a common iconography. Now, the numismatic evidence has quite clear associations and recognisable trends. There's quite strong influence from other gods, namely iconographic motifs or identifiers, and most of these tend to be things like the Dioscuri. We get elements such as stars and other attributes which we associate with them, including horses and spears, as well as this dual nature of them, coming across quite strongly. Now, the overall trends show two distinct representations of the Kabeiroi. The first is seen as a bearded, mature male, such as this figure here from Boeotis, and the other, this suggests that there are at least two Kabeiroi recognised, one mature and the other young, and we have various depictions which could be associated with the Pais figure from Thebes. The only problem we have with this identification is that the hat worn by this figure here, it's never seen on Theban iconography on Kabeiros. If we see this hat at all, it's usually on the head of Odysseus. Indeed, in one scene, he is actually using his hat as he runs. Now we also have Thessaloniki coinage, and here we have Kabeiros labelled in his temple, and he's got the metalworking association, as I mentioned. Now, so the coins perhaps are more negotiable in terms of interpretation, because of this lack of perhaps definite identification. The stonework that we've got for the cult is quite scanty. This is a sculptural relief from Lebedia in Boeotia, and this seems to tie in with the idea that they are quite divine, they're perfect, and again it's got quite a strong Dioscuric element. And this scene shows the Curetes and perhaps the Coriobantes with the shields, perhaps the two Kabeiroi, as well as perhaps an initiate, which is the figure who's fully robed to one side. Now, there are possible other scenes showing Kabeiros in sculpture, but many of these have been recently called into question. There was a figure identified as Kabeiros, which was very much the Boeotian Theban equivalent on an altar relief from Pergamon, but now this is a bit debated. And scenes with these gods can be seen on coinage from places like the Black Sea very strongly, as well as Asia Minor. So this stands in quite a contrast to the pottery. So Blakely's assertion that the iconography of the Kabeiric cult is overwhelmingly pygmy-like and grotesque seems somewhat unfounded. On the basis of the archaeological material, the figures are very clearly undistorted and instead reflect the ideals of the human form during this period. Whilst the statues to whom Herodotus refers show caricatured or grotesque elements, there is also a very strong possibility that these figures are not Kabeiroi. Rather, they are the Egyptian equivalent of the Kabeiroi and have simply been translated into the Greek, in much the same way that Ammon is often identified as Zeus in the Greek sources. Alternatively, there seems to be a very strong, long-standing tradition of presenting Kabeiros as a well-proportioned male in a similar manner to depictions of Dionysus or those traditional representations of Greek heroes. The iconography, however, remains a curiosity. There are unfortunately no real explanations as to why certain figures on Kabeiric ware vases are executed in such a comedic fashion. The depictions of the Kabeiroi may tie in with the perception of the cult in antiquity. The Kabeiric cult may have offered protection or even salvation, not joking matters. And the serious nature of the cult is reflected in the literature. Those who acted impiously against these gods felt their retribution. Therefore, if you were to mock the gods in this fashion by parodying them, it seems safer to parody those who aren't involved in this particular cult. The parodied examples may be reflecting theatrical elements, either actual performances at the sanctuary or perhaps adaptations of Athenian or Corinthian iconography. If we consider that the majority of the vessels are used for use within the symposiastic setting, their comic nature becomes very straightforward to explain. There is little difference between a Kabeiric ware vessel and a kylix that's been decorated to appear like a grotesque mask while drinking, or one that has a frightening monster or sexual or comic scene on the interior that is only revealed once all the liquid has been consumed. Parodying the cult itself would surely appeal to the participants, perhaps as something as an insider joke. Thank you.